My focus today is on huts as a means of supporting the crush of Americans wanting to escape the cities and suburbs for overnight walking, skiing, or biking adventures. I'm excited to share some of the grassroots innovation underway as Americans are creating 21st century huts. I hope these initiatives, many of which are under the radar screen of mainstream land management professionals, will prompt you, outdoor professionals, to speculate about the roles that huts might play on U.S. trails. How many of you have spent a night in a hut? Okay, good. A fair number. How many of you have spent more than one night in a hut? Okay. I'm going to start by defining and describing hut systems. What is a hut? Is it a hovel, a shelter, a hostel, a cabin, or a hotel? Well, it turns out it's all of the above, and really much more. I define this fuzzy term, a hut, as an enclosed structure that it could include cabins, yurts, teepees, and platform tents. And it's designed to support long-distance human-powered travel. A hut system is a chain of 3 or more huts, carefully sited a day's walk, bike, or ski apart on maintained trails. Now, there are thousands of individual huts, cabins, and yurts in the United States. My focus is on hut-to-hut systems where they're connected to support multi-day, non-motorized travel. So why should huts interest this audience? In a nutshell, huts broaden access to the outdoors while mitigating the resulting human impacts. And they are classrooms for innovation in environmental education and conservation. While huts are standard tools in the kits of recreation managers in other parts of the world, most U.S. land managers know little about them. As world leaders in setting aside land for protection and recreation, the U.S. has pioneered in 2 forms of overnight stays: car camping and backpacking. Car camping is all about convenience, and backpacking caters to the 4% of rugged Americans who prefer solitude and have the necessary gear, skills, resiliency to get out into the backcountry. Hut systems fall somewhere in the broad middle ground between these 2 modalities that are so popular in the U.S. Yes, you may shrug, huts are popular in Europe, but they really don't fit the rugged, spacious, recreational scene of the United States. And besides, why in the world would we want to start building buildings in the very land that we're trying to protect? Well, what I've learned in studying huts is that when you look closely, they have far more potential for environmental protection and education than most Americans realize. Let's take a closer look at how they operate and where they are. The common elements that all huts have all over the world are shelter from the storm, potable water, a heat source, bunks, and responsible methods of waste management. Many are very basic. New Zealanders, for example, refer fondly to their huts as wooden tents. You bring your own sleeping bag, food, and cook stove. The majority of European huts, on the other hand, are full service. They offer hot meals, often with beer and wine, and beds with pillows and blankets. Well, where are the huts? I've got a dense chart that's in the handout, and the main thing to take away from this now is that there are tens of thousands of huts and shelters all over the world. Nobody really knows how many there are. The world's largest hut system is in New Zealand, 962 huts, government-run. There are thousands of huts in Europe, and not so many in the United States. While we can learn from other nations, I believe America will follow its own path, experimenting with huts in ways that reflect local terrain, weather, culture, traditions, and needs. I was really struck some years ago in talking with Marco Volkan, a Swiss hut expert, when he said to me, "Sam, sure, study the Swiss huts if you want to know how huts were conceived in the late 19th century. But we Europeans can't wait for Americans to get into huts and show us what 21st century huts will look like." After the Appalachian Mountain Club built the first U.S. recreational hut in 1888, growth was slow for a century. Car camping and later backpacking boomed. Suddenly, in the 1980s, the number of hut systems in the U.S. more than doubled. How and why this happened is another story, but it just shows how quickly a trend can accelerate when it meets current needs. Today, we have between 18 and 23 hut systems in the United States, depending on how you define and count them. In the U.S., mostly you bring your own food and you cook it yourself on propane stoves, typically, that are offered by the hut system. However, there are 3 full-service hut systems in the U.S. and a few more that stock food in the hut that you cook yourself. Today, America has about 105 huts as part of systems and about 1,500 bunks. The majority are operated as nonprofits, while a number are small family businesses, particularly in the western part of the country. 2 hut systems in Alaska are operated by the BLM, and several more by the Alaska DNR. The majority are located on state or federal lands. 10 are on U.S. Forest Service land, 7 on state lands, and 2 are in U.S. national parks. The rest are on a mix of private, timber, and tribal lands. While America has comparatively few hut-to-hut opportunities, they're remarkably diverse. In addition to the 23 hut systems listed on the handout, there are at least 8 hut systems either in the planning stages or expanding. And the situation is similar in Canada. Looking at some trends and examples of innovation in the U.S., the Mount Tahoma Trail system in Washington state operates an all-volunteer hut system on state and tribal lands. In the arena of trails to towns, huts as economic development initiatives are beginning to pop up. Adirondacks, hamlets to huts with major planning support from New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation and Department of State will open soon. The Friends of the Columbia River Gorge are in planning stages, have a hut system in planning stages, town to town. Land trusts are starting to look at hut systems as a way of connecting people to the land they're protecting. In 2018, Montana's innovative American Prairie Reserve opened the first U.S. hut system that is not located in the mountains. While our first hut systems were all about hiking, the growth today is in biking and skiing, with many systems incorporating all 3 modalities. Any mountain bikers out there? For a glimpse of the future, you can bike hut to hut for 6 days from Telluride to Moab on the San Juan hut systems, one of their 2 bike trails. And also keep an eye out on the future development of huts on the state-supported 670-mile Oregon Timber Trail. The huts are not there yet, but it's part of the plan. The 10th Mountain Division huts partner with Colorado Hut Systems to handle their reservations. And the Colorado Alliance of Huts and Yurts meets regularly to explore common cause. The Vermont Huts Association is working with the State Parks and Recreation Department and other partners to lay the groundwork for a statewide system of connected huts. Even alpine ski areas responding to the latest boom in backcountry skiing are talking about huts in the context of what they are calling the next big thing, uphill skiing. And what I've learned is that the American public loves huts. The demand is much greater than the supply. Occupancy rates are high. Many systems require booking up to a year in advance. And several have turned to lotteries to help manage the demand. The U.S. appears to be entering a new stage of experimentation with huts. I wouldn't be surprised if the number of hut systems more than doubles in the next 10 to 15 years. Now let's look at 4 key benefits of huts on trails. The first benefit is that huts mitigate environmental impacts. By concentrating use in purpose-built facilities, huts protect heavily visited overnight sites. Sited far from fragile ecosystems, they are carefully designed to absorb and minimize the environmental impacts of overnight visitors, including waste management, soil compaction, trampling of vegetation, and habitat disruption. In combination, huts and trails are powerful tools for steering people away from fragile landscapes and minimizing human impacts. Like parking restrictions and backpacking permits, huts are another tool for controlling access. For example, for over 130 years, New Hampshire's AMC huts in the White Mountain National Forest have thoughtfully channeled thousands of people annually through fragile alpine zones. The High Sierra camps in Yosemite National Park have been doing the same thing for 100 years. But let's face it, if these hut systems were applying for special use permits today, they would be denied. Well, think about it. Are there other iconic landscapes that might benefit from purpose-built infrastructure to reduce human impacts on the environment and enforce access controls? Jackson Hole, Grand Tetons area comes to mind for me. What about you? The second benefit is that huts broaden access to nature, making overnights in the outdoors a more welcoming experience. We are a highly diverse and urbanized nation, and much of the growing pressure on our public lands is coming from city dwellers. The Census Bureau tells us that 80% of Americans live in cities and suburbs. Put differently, 63% of Americans live on 4% of our lands. We clearly need more nearby nature. An obvious role for hut systems is as front country infrastructure, connecting population centers to nature. This is not a new idea in America. It goes back even further than Benton McKay's vision for the Appalachian Trail as refuge from the cities. Today, millions of urbanites suffer from what Richard Louv has called nature deficit disorder, and many don't feel welcome in the outdoors. In response, we are innovating a range of inclusive nature-based programs, and we are expanding our remarkable network of parks and trails. To meet the demand for overnight stays, we are expanding campgrounds, including a proliferation of drive-in yurts and camper cabins. These may be steps in the right direction, but why not let people ditch the cars and experiment with hut hopping? City dwellers dream of getting away from it all, from screens, from noise, from cars, at least for a few days, at least a few times in their lives. We know that traveling consecutively for days, spending evenings cooking, playing games, and storytelling is an incredibly potent form of nature immersion. Overnight experiences connect people, particularly children and families, with nature and with each other in ways that enhance environmental awareness, change behaviors, and create a sense of community around environmental responsibility. But realistically, how can we possibly meet the growing demand for overnight experiences without trashing the land? Most city dwellers do not have the skills, gear, or resiliency to go backpacking for a few days. At first, many are afraid of nature, particularly of snakes, bears, and spiders, and they don't like to sleep on the ground. Some ethics groups prefer to experience the out of doors in community rather than as rugged individuals. As safe, cozy community spaces, huts are a welcoming stepping stones from the city to the country and perhaps into the wild, and should be part of the solution. The third benefit is that huts operate as shared infrastructure for environmental education. Today's hut systems are convivial backcountry classrooms. Earlier today, Mike Couts and James Wrigley presented a detailed picture of how current U.S. hut systems are promoting health, heritage, and happiness. I don't have time to go into it. There's a little selection in the handout. In short, over 115,000 people stay in hut systems annually, and 20,000 of them participate in programming offered by the hut system itself or by partner organizations, using the huts as base camps for learning and for service. Imagine building on this by experimenting with time-honored forms of using a physical journey to support inward journeys of redemption, renewal, and environmental insight. And by updating ancient practices such as rites of passage and pilgrimage to promote 21st century environmental citizenship. Fourth benefit, huts can serve as shared infrastructure for conservation. Over the years, the U.S. Forest Service and the Civilian Conservation Corps built hundreds of working cabins as infrastructure for forestry, fire prevention, conservation, education. If America ever returns to the idea of a CCC, it may well include a new generation of working huts. Some will be permanently sited, while others will be relocatable to new work sites to adapt as we learn from experimentation, as signs of climate change and overuse emerge on our lands. Finally, let's look at the challenges and pitfalls of huts. Yes, I'm a hut nut, but I'm also a very practical guy. Let me be clear, huts do not belong on most of our trails. They should be used only in thoughtfully targeted places and situations. If they are not carefully sited, designed, and operated, they can do more harm than good. America has a lot to learn about whether, where, and how to use huts. Some of the key challenges in guiding experimentation with huts include learning how to navigate the regulatory environment while not discouraging innovation. Research comparing the environmental impacts of all methods of overnight stays. Keeping huts simple and affordable, and not just becoming a form of glamping. Keeping operations environmentally sound, and finally, ensuring safety and security. To help meet these challenges, we need a national community of practice around huts. It can develop a set of best practices for huts and a statement of environmental ethics to guide future hut development. In conclusion, I hope you will engage in the growing number of grassroots innovations shaping the future of U.S. hut systems. The public is on board, and your expertise is essential to help guide this nascent movement for the public good. Land managers will ensure that huts do no harm. I hope that you will all also contribute leadership in reimagining huts, the oldest form of human habitation, as 21st century recreational, educational, and conservation infrastructure. Thank you.